All right, let's talk about tile sets. Let's talk about tile mapping in Unity. One of the things that you can do to make development of your games, especially 2D side scrollers and top-down games, one of the things you can do to make these much faster is to implement tile maps. Something that will automatically take the tile sets that you have and place them into the scene in a way that makes them fit together automatically. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through how to get the tile map settings into your project. I'm going to talk about how to set up your rule tiles. I'm going to talk about how to set up tile maps into the scene. And we'll talk a little bit about how to put physics onto those tile maps if you're doing something like level geometry. So the first thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to go to this website here. Now, I'm going to put this into the description, so you should be able to go click on that, but that's where it is. You go here, click on download, then download zip, unzip that, and then you want to drag the Tilemap folder from that into your, so here's what it looks like when you unzip it. You want to drag this Tilemap folder into your Unity asset. So I've already brought this in, and you can see I've got all these bits and pieces in there. The other thing you'll need is an actual tile set to use. So in this case, I've got this image here, some dirt and grass top tiles. So I haven't actually done pretty much anything other than import the assets yet. So let's get the settings right. We'll turn this to multiple. This particular tile set is 16 by 16, so we'll go 16 pixels per unit. Tight, that's fine. We'll go point because this is pixel art, so we need to have essentially no filter on it. I also like to override this and make sure we're getting the exact colors by using this one here. This is not always entirely necessary, but I just like having exact colors. So we'll apply that. We'll go up to the sprite editor, and now, oh, that's actually gotten a little bit bigger than my window size. There we go, now it's inside. Okay, so here is it. Now we're gonna slice it. We will go grid by cell size, and in this case, because it's 16 by 16 pixels, we will go 16 by 16, go slice and apply, and now you can see that we've got all of our individual tiles nicely sliced. Now, one of the things you might notice is that they are a bit small compared to the amount of space that we have available, and I've got the slider all the way up. So one of the ways that we can fix this, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not a permanent fix, you have to change it back eventually, but what we can do is we can open this in another program. So I use Pixel Edit, so I'm going to import it into Pixel Edit. We can then export it again, and we'll go, yep, that's what we want. We'll go browse, save it as this, but we're going to save it with a pixel scale higher. So it was 16 by 16, we've gone pixel scale of 4, so now it's 64 by 64. We'll save that, override it, yes. Now when we come back into Unity, we will find that it's only a tiny small section that's actually been split now, and the reason is because we're gonna have to change this to the new settings, 64 by 64. We'll go to sprite editor again. Yes, apply import settings. Now we go slice again, grid by cell size 64 by 64, and we should find that, yes, now it has sliced it correctly. And because the tiles are bigger, yes, we can actually see them much nicer now. And you don't necessarily want to keep them at this size because they'll be taking up more space than they need to in your eventual project build and in your project files. But it's really helpful to get them nice and bigger so you can, when we're making our rule tile, we have much bigger squares to look at, and it's much easier to distinguish which tile is which. Okay, so let's create our rule tile. Now I've made a folder already, so we'll go into that. We right click in here, go create, and because we've imported these tilemap settings here, or these tilemap files, we will have the option to create a rule tile. Now create that, give it a name. I'm going to call this grass ground because that's what it is. And you can see over here we've got, this is where we're going to set our settings. So let's go back to the sprites. Let's put in, I always like to put this one as the default sprite because I think it's, when you're looking at it on the tile palette, it's the easiest way to tell what it is you're actually grabbing. Now, we'll go grid. I always set this to grid, even though for some reason Unity never believes me that I want it to be grid. But grid. And this is useful for when you're doing, this is essentially the physics part of it. So when you go to put the physics onto it, it's going to treat each of the tiles you've placed like an actual square. You can set it to sprite as well, and now it's going to be a bit more tight on the sprite, but for what we're doing, it's going to be more efficient to just use a square. This is how the tile set works, is we have a list of rules, and then when we place our tiles into the scene, it's going to pick which one of these images to use based on the list of rules that we give it. So I'm just going to create a fairly simple set of rules to begin with, like a fairly basic set of rules. You can get pretty much as specific as you want to with it, but we're just going to go fairly basic to begin with. So we click the plus button to add a new rule. I'm going to just drag in the very first tile, and now let's have a look at the different settings that we have. In terms of the rule type, we have fixed, rotated, mirror X, and mirror Y. This is if you have tiles that are rotatable. So if you're doing a top-down setting that isn't, if it's like directly top-down, it's not skewed, then you might find that the corners will work for the top right, the top left, the bottom right, and the bottom left, in which case the rule that you would put in for the top right will work rotated to the top left and work rotated to the bottom right, you know? So that's how we use that. A similar thing for the mirror. You might find that you have, in a side scroller, you have a platform, and say that we had a platform edge like this. Because of the stripes, it's not going to work for ours, but if it weren't for the stripes, you might find that that piece would work as this piece as well, just flipped, in which case you might set this here to mirror. Now, that's not going to work for ours because we have those stripes on it, so I'm going to set it to fixed. Now, for collider, we're going to set this to grid, and that means that anytime we place this particular tile, it's going to treat that like a square. We could use sprite and make it more exact. We could use none if we didn't want this to have any physics on it at all, but this is part of our ground, so we're going to set it to grid. Now, output, we've got a few settings here. We're going to use single, but there are a few other options. I'll just quickly go over them. Random would be if you have a number of tiles that fit the same rule and you could use any of them. You want to add some randomization. You would go random, select how many you wanted in there, and then you would place your extras into these sections here. Animation, very similar thing. If you have a tile that you want to animate, you would place the separate animation frames into these sections here, and then it would cycle through them whenever this tile is placed. So let's go back to single, because that's what we're doing. Now, this part here is where the actual rules come in. What we have here is we have a 3x3 grid, and basically this represents, the middle here is the tile itself, and on the outside, these are all of the potential tiles that can be placed around it. And in these ones, you can either have nothing, in which case it doesn't consider it, it doesn't care what it is. You can have the green arrow, which means that there will definitely be something in that direction, or you can have a cross, which means there definitely isn't something in that direction. So for our tile here, we're looking at the top left-hand corner of a ground, so we would know that there's going to be nothing along this edge, there's going to be nothing along this edge, so we can go crosses here, crosses there, and we know that there definitely is something on this edge, and there definitely is something on this edge, so we'll go green here and green there. Now, when we place it, anytime that it comes across a tile that has nothing above and nothing to the left, and it does have something below, and it does have something to the right, it's going to go, this is the rule that fits, and it's going to place this tile. So let's get a few more in. Let's go, the next one in line is this one here. So this has nothing above, but it does have something to the left, beneath, and to the right. Now, like I said, Unity doesn't necessarily believe me when I tell it to use grid as the default, so I'm going to reset that to grid. You'll see me doing it for everything because Unity, for some reason, has default colliders but doesn't believe you. When we go to place this one here, you can see that it is essentially just the mirror image of this one here. So we'll go nothing, nothing, definitely something, definitely something. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through and I'm going to place in all of the tiles I would need for the edges of a rectangle of ground. So I might see this up, it depends how long it goes. Okay, so that is our rule tile for a rectangle of ground completed. We have that essentially done. Sometimes it takes Unity a little while to update, but this will eventually become this. Now, what we need to do is we need to put this rule tile onto our tile palette. Now, right now we don't have any tile palettes, so I'm going to go ahead and create one. I'm just going to call it palette because I am incredibly creative. Create it. Just don't worry about any of these settings, just leave them as is. I'm going to put it into the rule tiles folder. And so here we have our palette here. Now to make it actually look like a palette, we just grab any of our rule tiles and we drag it onto the palette. So there we can see our rule tile on the palette. Now, the next step is to get it from our palette into our scene. Now the way we do that is by creating a tile map. Again, it's fairly simple. You just right click in the hierarchy and you go 2D object and tile map. And that's one of the options that you will have if you have imported these files here. Now, a tile map needs to be on a grid, but you don't need to worry about that. You just create a tile map and it'll create the grid for you and place the tile map onto it. I'm going to rename the tile map to ground so I can remember what it is. Now, if we have multiple tile maps, any of the tile maps you have available will be in this drop-down menu. So let's just create another one just so we can see that. So when we go over here, we've got ground, the one we created before, and we also have one called tile map. I'm going to go back to ground. I'm going to delete this one because we don't need it. Just using it to show what we're talking about. So let's quickly just go over the tools at the top here. This is selection tool. If we had anything here, we could select it. This moves it, so if we selected something, we could click this and move it around. This is our brush. This is probably the most self-explanatory. You just click and drag to draw into the scene here. This one is a square tool, so you would click and drag to create squares. And we have the eyedropper, which will select them, an eraser, also pretty self-explanatory, and a bucket tool to fill some tiles. Now let's draw in some ground with our existing rule tile. Select it in the tile palette. I'm going to use the rectangle tool because we have only created rules for rectangles. And you can see when we draw it in, it's going to draw in some rectangles of ground. And you can see that when we place it in, it's placing the tiles that we asked it to place based on the rules. So in the case of this one here, you can see it is the top right and there is nothing above. There is nothing to the right, but there is something to the left and below. If we go back to our rule tile, we will see that the tile we have asked it to place when there is nothing above, nothing to the right, but there is something to the left and below is this tile here. And that is the tile it has placed. Now, we're going to run into a few issues here because our rule set is so simple. If we go to create anything more complex than just rectangles of ground, and we will find that it's not going to know what to do with those edges. So you can see that in here, what's happened is we've got these corners and they should have something going on. Now, you might find that in the tiles you've created, this is fine. You just want the regular default inside to be the inside of your inside corners. But that's not exactly what we want. It doesn't look quite so natural to have these spaces, this break in the tile. So we're going to go through and we're just going to quickly create the rules for these sections here. So let's go back to our rule tile. Let's create a new rule. Now we're going to say that let's do this one here first. So it has something above, it has something to the left, it has something to the right, it has something below, but it doesn't have something here. And we know for sure it won't have anything here because that is what we're trying to create. So we'll go a red cross there and we'll find the sprite that corresponds with that. That's this one here. We'll drag it in. Now what you'll see is that it hasn't actually updated to this. And the reason is because we've got our rules in the wrong order. Now if you can see here, we've got a rule that says if there's something above, to the left, to the right, and below, place this one. Now what's happened is it's gotten to here and it says there is something above, to the left, to the right, and below. Aha, I'm going to use this rule here. And now, even though this rule is more specific and more fitting to the scenario, because it's gotten to here and it's found a rule that fits, it's going to use this one. So if we want to use this particular rule, we need to make sure it's above this one in the order. You can see when we moved it up, it's updated, and now these inside corners are using the correct tile. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to put in all of our inside corners now. Again, I might speed this up depending on how this goes. Now, so what we have here is we have a rule set that whenever there is any amount of ground that has at least 2 tiles wide, we're going to have the correct tiles placed. It's going to break a little if we try and go 1 tile wide because we don't quite have the rules for single tile width placements, but anytime it's at least 2 tiles wide, we're going to have the correct tiles placed. And you can see here that we essentially have gotten to a point where it's almost looking like a level already. You could pretty much imagine putting a character into this and just letting it run along and jump over these gaps, because that's essentially what we've gotten to. This is how simple it is to create these levels with this set of tools. Now you might notice that I am deleting some tiles here and there. That is something I'm doing with the shift. If you're using either of these two tools, the paintbrush or the rectangle tool, you can just hold shift and that tool becomes an eraser. And if you're using the box, it becomes a box eraser. So that's how that works. I'm just going to quickly set up the character for this, and I'm going to go through how to create, how do we put physics onto these tile maps that we've created. Okay, I'll be back in a sec. Now, so we have our scene set up with our player. It's just a white square for now. Let's make this background something that isn't the default Unity blue. That's nice, a nice sky blue. So we have our scene. If we click play, the player is just going to fall directly through the ground because the tile map has no physics on it at all. So what we're going to do here to put physics onto it is we're going to go select our tile map. So that's ground here. We're going to add a component to it. Now we just need to type in tile, and what we want is the Tilemap Collider 2D. Now if we place that onto our tile map, we'll see that it has placed a physics collider onto every one of the tiles we have placed. Now I'm not sure how well this works in previous versions of Unity, but I'm doing this in 2017.3.1, and it has something we can put onto this to make it a little less of a giant grid of squares, and we can put on a composite collider 2D. Now what we do with this, We don't want it to have a particularly dynamic rigid body. We're just going to set this to static. The only reason we need this is because the composite collider needs a rigid body, so we'll leave it on. We won't take it off, but set it to static, so it's essentially not a rigid body. Then what we need to do to make it use this is we go up to here to the Tilemap Collider 2D and we click Use by Composite. And now what we have is it's combined all of the individual squares of physics components into a single physics component that will act as one object in the scene. I'm not really going to talk about how to put physics onto your character. I'm kind of assuming that you either have that already or you know how to do that. If that's something you want to hear me talk more about in relation to tile maps, then maybe leave a comment. I would like to do another video on tile maps. So yeah, if there's anything you want me to talk about more in that video, leave a comment and I will try and get onto it. So, the physics I have on the player, essentially what it's looking for is a collider on the layer ground. So I make sure I set this ground tile map to the ground layer. What we should find is we click play now and the player is able to walk along it and jump and interact with it as if it were the level. And you can see now why this is really useful for prototyping, because I can just go in here, go back to the tile palette, grab my tool, change this entirely in really quick succession, and now I have an entirely new level to play with, and it was super quick to create it. So I can see here, this jump isn't possible. So I just go in here, draw in some different geometry that I think might fit better. We'll click play, and hey presto, that's our level. So that is all I had want to talk about in regards to tile maps for now. This is the first video I've done like this, so I'd be really interested to hear anyone's feedback. If there's something you liked I did, if there's something you didn't quite like about the way I presented this, then leave a comment. If you if you want to see more of these, if you maybe not so interested, just let me know. I'm really interested to see how people are thinking about this. And yeah, definitely if you have anything you want me to cover more in another video, just leave a comment letting me know and I'll try to get onto it. All right, thanks. Okay, so I almost forgot. If you liked the tiles that I was using in this, I actually have them for sale on itch.io. It's not just the tiles you've seen, it's those tiles plus a bunch more. So it's got the character, it's got all these props. It has essentially enough to make a full scene of a game with some animations. We've got the animated flowers here. We've got some animated chests. So this chest down here will animate when we drop down to it. So yeah, it's itch.io. I'll be leaving the link in the description as well. If you liked this tutorial, maybe consider supporting me. Thanks. All right, bye.